All right, so I'm given the go-ahead to go ahead and get started here. Good morning for another couple minutes, everybody. My name is Jamison Scheeres. First, a disclaimer. I speak for myself and no one else. And what you're about to hear is not technical at all. If you're here looking for some kind of technical talk, you might want to go check out one of the other ones. Quick, who am I? At Son of Shirt on Twitter. Computer geek. I spent 10 plus years in the military. I have 10 plus years of professional info experience. I have a BS in social sciences, MS in info resource management. I did a master's thesis on social engineering, working on MS and comp sci, and co-founder of a red team at a major US bank. All right, so I was joking with Mick Douglas. Who was in Mick Douglas's talk just a few minutes ago? All right, so Mick was talking about a really dry topic and trying to make it sexy. I'm going to try and take a really sexy topic and make it a little dry. What am I going to talk about today? Social engineering. We're going to talk about a little bit of social psychology. A key debate, I think, in the social engineering discussion. Way we can use social engineering, some FUD, other stuff, and what can we actually do about it. All right, so let's level set. Let's take out what a definition of social engineering is. So here's some definitions. So Wikipedia, August 2010, practice of getting information. What's interesting is a year later they actually have a different definition. That's Wikipedia for you. Some other folks, about.com and se.org. I really respect Chris Hadnagy and work with him, active manipulating folks to accomplish goals that may or may not be in the target's best interest. Now we're going to talk about that last one kind of in particular because that I think can be pretty broadly defined. So social engineering, oddly enough, is not a new concept. And that term itself specifically has been around for over 100 years. There's another definition that's commonly referred to, and it's a discipline within political science that refers to efforts to influence people on a large scale. It's propaganda. Webster also defines it as management of human beings in accordance with their place and function in society. So there's a couple of competing definitions here of social engineering that don't necessarily fit within the InfoSec framework. And the first known reference is 1899. So there's a completely different set of definitions out there that people are using, which causes some confusion sometimes. And there's really not a secondary definition in Webster for social engineering, which means the InfoSec community hasn't really gotten into Webster yet, right? I'm going to go over the quick origins of the term. In 1894, Dutch industrialists coined a term called sociaal-industrieel in engineers. In 1899, it was brought to the US. 97 years passed using the term this way. And then in 1996, a guy named Jimmy Coe, who works for McAfee, defines the term as some who find out they have a virus and don't go telling their friends because they're forced to admit they've been doing these things which are unethical. That's not our current definition of social engineering, and that's barely a decade and a half ago. In 1998, Jerusalem Reports refers to social engineering as a euphemism for economic crime. We'll talk about that in a sec. And then Dorothy Denning in 1999 really, I think, is the first recorded instance I can find of social engineering in its current form, and how we currently understand it in information security community. All right, so social engineering is a euphemism. It's a term that we use to refer to something that may be offensive to others, so we take something that's a term and use it to kind of soften the message a little bit. There's some fun euphemisms. There's a ton out there. A lot of them are sexual because those tend to be easier to offend folks with. But bought the farm, who's familiar with that term? Yeah, it's common in the aviation community. I know some of the Air Force guys definitely raised their hand. But it's, to crash, wag the dog. That's another one that's out there, and especially in political circles. Pwn is actually one we use here in the information security community, that anybody outside of the information security community wouldn't understand and wouldn't know what that means. So we're using these terms that if we talk to someone that has nothing to do with information security, say an executive, and we use this term out there and we try to define it for them, they have no idea what we're talking about, right? And so we need to find, in my opinion, we need to find some good ways of communicating with and communicating these thought processes better. So what is the term social engineering masking when it comes to information security, right? Because the whole point of a euphemism is to mask something that might be offensive. Well, cons, right? So we know social engineering by other terms, and those have been around for a long, long time. Confidence games, scams, a hustle, grifting. Everybody watch the show Leverage? Fun show. It's a fun show about doing evil things, and they have a person on their team that's dedicated to what we would term social engineering. Only they don't use the term social engineering. They use grifter. That's what they refer to as. So we also know social engineering by their faces. Who knows who this guy is? Who is he? That's right, Frank Abagnale Jr. You probably also know him by that face. He's the guy in the Catch Me If You Can, right? Now you could argue that guy was a master social engineer. He's a master con man, right? Does anybody not know the exploits of Frank Abagnale? Go over them real quick. All right, so Frank Abagnale Jr., he convinced folks that he was an airline pilot at age 16 or 17. He convinced folks he was a surgeon, an ER surgeon, and a lawyer and other things. And he went through this crazy scheme, and he was convincing folks that he was actually these things. And all it took was a little bit of cojones and a little bit of knowledge, right? So he's there studying documents in the evening, trying to read up on medical terminology and watching TV shows on medical terminology just so he can get by in his job as an ER tech, right? Anybody know who this guy is? That is Ponzi. Everybody know the term Ponzi scheme, right? You could argue that this guy, he was operating in the early 1900s, scam artist. That's what he's commonly referred to as one of the greatest scam artists of all time. And again, you could argue that he was using, what, social engineering. Anybody know why I would put this up here? Anybody heard the term, I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge? You know that actually comes from someone who actually tried and was successful in selling the Brooklyn Bridge a lot. A guy named George Parker in the late 1800s, early 1900s, literally sold deeds to the Brooklyn Bridge over and over and over again. He made lots of money doing that. And the way he was able to do that is to getting people to believe who he was, that he was this sales guy, that he actually had the rights to sell the Brooklyn Bridge, and he did that using what we would call today social engineering. All right, so what are some key elements of what we refer to as social engineering? I would argue, based on some of the definitions that we saw above, getting someone to do something is pretty elemental to social engineering. That actually eliminates some of these things that I've heard referred to as social engineering, like dumpster diving, shoulder surfing. I've heard of both of those referred to as social engineering. No. What else does that sound like? Anybody have an idea kind of where I'm going here? If you try and get someone to do something? Leadership, manipulation. Very good. So one element that is often debated, and we'll talk about this a little later, is deception required for something to be referred to as social engineering? I would argue maybe yes. It's a fundamental part of what separates social engineering from other forms of persuasion. Some might argue no. Social engineering is simply convincing someone to do what you want them to do. So why is it so darn effective? Why do we fall for these scams? Why are people vulnerable to this? Well, anybody know Mike Murray? Mike Murray is a good dude. He has a talk out there that he's done and said, this is a bug. It's not a bug. It's a feature. It's a feature of the human population that we trust each other and we're able to communicate with each other. It's what allowed us to go from that to that, right? It allows us to build civilizations. It allows us to develop as a society, and allows us to be able to communicate effectively with one another. All right, so I'm going to take a little sidebar into social psychology. We're going to talk about social expectation, conformity. All right, so social expectation. In most societies, our social interactions happen in a pretty orderly manner, right? We all drive on the right-hand side of the road. We all talk to each other in a very specific language. We all have certain expectations. You guys aren't just standing up, milling about, talking to one another while I'm up here presenting, right? That would be rude. That's a social expectation. We open car doors for ladies, right? That was a social expectation that has probably become less prominent with the whole feminist movement, but certainly when this picture was taken, probably the 50s. So there's a social expectation there, right? Enough said. Leadership. I would argue that leaders define social expectations in the people around them, right? And that's part of what makes them a leader. So this group is really interesting, right? So I'm talking to a bunch of hackers. Now, I see a lot of black shirts in the audience, right? Raise your hand if you have a black shirt on or have worn one in the last 2 days. Right, so that's a social almost expectation and a conformist idea of this whole hacker community, right? So hackers in general, most people are sheep, right? But hackers in general take some pride in themselves of being nonconformists, right? They're the black sheep, but with black t-shirts on. So this group, everybody in certain circumstances likes to conform. All right, so I'm going to go over real quick what we're talking about when we refer to this idea of social engineering. Influence, right? So that's instilling a motivation without force and coercion. It can be very subtle. It doesn't have to be overt. Marketing folks use this all the time. Anybody knows anything in particular about the FedEx sign? That's right. We have an arrow in the middle of the FedEx sign that gives you the perception. Your subconscious picks up on that, right? And you think it's fast, they're on time, they're deliver. That's influence, but it's not actually, they're not doing anything overt there. It's just their sign. And actually, there's a lot. We'll go over a couple more later. So, anybody good with math? You know what the term up the top looks? Right. Subset, right? So we have a set and a subset, right? So I would argue that persuasion is a subset of influence, right? So influence with the added element of coercion. There's some 6 principles out there that was defined by Cialdini. You can read them for yourselves, but the element within all of them is that 1, they're effective, and 2, that they get folks to do something, right? They're persuading folks to do things that they wouldn't normally do. And I'll go over a couple of them real quick that might not be might be obvious. So reciprocation is used by marketing all the time, right? So I give you in fact, they're using it out there, right? They have the, put your business card in. If I give you an iPad, will I be able to talk to you? Or if I give you some swag, can I talk to you for 20 minutes, right? That's an element of reciprocation. Social proof is basically getting someone a familiarity with somebody, all right? So establishing a common element, right? So anybody here football fans? All right, so now we have a social proof with the folks that are football fans, and they can start a conversation with that and start to leverage that, right? Commitment and consistency is where folks like to do and follow through on what they say they're going to do. What's really interesting about this is that folks are going to follow through on not only what they say they're going to do, but on what they're going to defend their neighbor's consistency and integrity by if you can convince me that Bob over here told you to give you something, I'm going to defend his integrity by trying to help you out with your problem, right? It's an instance of commitment and consistency. Liking is pretty obvious. It's why there's, we use attractive folks in marketing and television. Authority. This one's really interesting for someone with a background in the military. I always think of the example of the airman or the private that's sitting behind the keyboard at the network operations center, right? And he gets a phone call, and it's General so-and-so. And General so-and-so tells you to do such and such. Well, if you don't really intervene there, the airman or the low-ranking person is going to do that, right? Is going to be compelled based on the culture that they're in to do that. Scarcity one is pretty obvious. You see this in marketing a lot, right? So only 3 left at this price. I see that on Amazon all the time. That adds an element of scarcity that makes you more likely to want to click on things and do things. All right, so let's, same element, social engineering, as we refer to it, is probably a subset of influence, right? I would also maybe argue, depending on whether or not you want to define whether or not social engineering actually makes you do something, because I've heard other definitions by some of the folks I talk to, that it's not just getting you to do something, it's making you think that you want to do that, and that I would define that almost as influence. Anyway, so there's a curveball here, and this is essential to what I think the fix is, and I'll talk about the fix later, but there's a term out there called illegitimate persuasion. And there's actually a number of guys out there who have done a fair amount of research on this since the 1960s. And they've been studying psychology. They talk about illegitimate persuasion as maybe using a doctor in an ad or an actor that plays a doctor in an ad, right? Instead of the actual doctor. So it's not the actual doctor that's trying to sell you that medication, it's some actor that's playing a doctor on TV, right? And that's kind of what they're using that as. But through that, they've developed a term called resistance to persuasion, and they've studied this, again, for the last 50 years or so. All right, so why are we susceptible? We talked about some of the reasons, right? We have the social conditioning that goes on. What's really interesting is that social conditioning is very different based on the culture that you're in. American culture has a very different level of social conditioning, a different type of social conditioning than, say, the German culture, the Japanese culture, or and a Muslim culture, right, or Islamic culture. And you're going to be susceptible to different levels of marketing. So if you ever travel overseas and you see like weird marketing campaigns, well, they're probably targeting folks in the specific culture that they're in, specific demographics, right? We target folks at very different demographics because they're susceptible and to different types of persuasion. If you watch football, you watch those kind of things, they have a very specific demographic. It's men 25 to 35. That's the demographic that they're targeting. And they're going to see more commercials about beer and video games and stuff like that. If you switch over to like the Oprah channel, you're going to see lots of commercials dedicated to women. So we figured this out a long time ago, and marketing folks use this to their advantage. Now, you could argue, and I know some folks do, that that's social engineering. That's getting someone to do something. I would argue the opposite. I would argue it's persuasion, and we've hijacked that term. All right, so quick debate. Who thinks deception is required for social engineering to define social engineering? I see 4 hands. I'm sorry? Are you counting omission? Yes, actually. So, all right, okay. Fair amount of folks, right? Who thinks it's not required? Who thinks that you don't have to have deception? Okay, so I see some other hands. This is a debate that I've had with a number of folks in the community. So I would argue that deception is pretty fundamental to the things that are similar, right? Synonyms for social engineering. Grifting, con games. If it's fundamental to those types of activities, why wouldn't it be fundamental to a social engineering? That's true. But what defines it? What makes it different than influence, right? If you're defining social engineering as influence, then why aren't you just using influence, right? All right, so using this term in marketing. Anybody see the smile? That's pretty obvious, right? But there's also some other things, a little more subtle. A to Z, it connects, like we have everything, right? Who sees the people with the chip dip? All right, so you got the T there and the I. So the people are sharing their chips and they're dipping it in the little thing with the I. That's not everybody picks up on that stuff, right? But it's a subtle way of influencing people to do or take action. All right, so FUD. Something that was near and dear to the hearts of many social or information security specialists, right? The world is going to end, and if we don't get XYZ appliance in place, or we don't install firewall, or whatever. And fear is a very powerful motivator. It's been studied pretty in depth. And we have our advanced persistent threat out there, and I actually pulled this off of a marketing page for a security company. And we use that all the time. That's okay, because other people do too, right? It's known in marketing. We have, back when the swine flu was, happening, and we had the whole flu virus and flu shots. Trying to get flu shots, right? That was a huge, really, marketing thing. I'm gonna tell you, it definitely was a problem, but that the medical community leveraged that and used it to their advantage to sell lots and lots and lots of flu virus. All right, so redefining the term or using it correctly. This slide is blank because I think it requires basically a bigger conversation with some of the, within the community. If we're going to be talking about this stuff, let's use the terms correctly. Let's talk about, social engineering as influence or influence correctly, right? So don't get me wrong. Social engineering is a problem that we're concerned about and need to be concerned about. I'll talk about in a couple minutes on how we can use it in fun and interesting ways. But we need to have some perspective. We need to avoid some FUD. It's an age-old problem. It's nothing new. People have been, quote unquote, probably social engineering each other since they've been communicating with each other practically. And it is a problem that's fixable. How many people have heard that you can't do anything about social engineering except train your folks, and that's never really going to be effective? I mean, yeah, right? So I'm going to talk about, real quick, some recent examples of social engineering. This is my FUD talk for about 2 minutes. All right, so this is actually one of my favorite cases of social engineering. Anybody heard of this? No? All right, so in 2007, ABN AMRO in Antwerp had a lot of diamonds stolen. Now, what's interesting about Antwerp? Anybody know what Antwerp is famous for? They're the diamond capital of Europe, at least, if not the world. And so they had a very unique operating environment at this bank. They allowed their customers access to the vault because folks needed to go in and out to be able to go and get their diamonds, right? And they needed to do that fairly quickly. So a gentleman just sets himself up as a businessman, basically disguises himself as a businessman, goes and starts befriending the folks at this bank. And he does that for a very long time. If you could call this a long con, right? This is because he did that for a year. And he got himself ingratiated with the folks at the bank to the point that he got access to the vault. And it was very easy for them to walk out with $26 million in diamonds. What's really interesting about this is that they had a $5 million security upgrade like 2 weeks before he actually did his deed, right? So we're building up all of our walls, right? And this guy just uses some charm to get in and get out. All right, so heard of this, right? Had a bunch of data stolen from a government contractor. I saw a quote, several terabytes of data stolen from the JSF project. JSF project is the Joint Strike Fighter F-35, for those who aren't familiar. It's a national security risk, advanced knowledge of a next-gen weapons system, and initial entry point was through social engineering, basically through a phishing campaign. Now, folks are, a particular company in particular that we'll see on the next slide is using, their skills. They're the APT, right? And they're using it as basically a security or a geopolitical strategy on catching up with to the United States in information prowess, essentially, right? So a couple years later, a particular company or country creates their own stealth fighter. All right, so 2009, you guys heard of Aurora. It's a good example of a pretty targeted attack. Someone did a lot of OSINT on these individuals, gained a lot of intellectual property, and used public information about folks to rip them off. The one thing I like about this is it highlights the social networks. Social networks have been kind of a boon for those of us that are pen testers, right? If you want to know something about somebody, just go check out their Facebook page, LinkedIn page, all kinds of other things, and find what you need. RSA, we know about that. Who hasn't heard of RSA over the weekend? All right, I'll skip past that. There are others. Epsilon, HP Gary, all victims of social engineering, one way, shape, or form. All right, so leveraging this in a pen test or in a way the bad guys do. We do this naturally, right? So some folks are just naturally predilected to social, being able to influence others, right? Some folks have the ability to charm others in a personal setting or other ways. But you can actually learn to do this as well. It's really not that hard to do. If anybody happen to participate in the social engineering CTF in DEF CON? No? Anybody not hear about the CTF and DEF CON? You have folks that basically coming up off the street to do social engineering, and there's a lot of work that goes into that. Don't get me wrong, because they do a lot of pre-work and they do a lot of thought processes. But it actually shows pretty well, I think, how some of this happens. We apply principles of persuasion and come up with some ideas of how to actually social engineer folks. So we have the authority. Again, I talked about that, consistency and deceptive relationship. I would argue that the guy who did the ABN AMRO scam, that's a deceptive relationship, right? His whole purpose for being, into that situation was to deceive folks. Ponzi schemes are another one. Overloading, I like this one. It's buffer overflow for humans, right? We tend to fail open. And when someone gets overwhelmed with information, like I'm sure actually a lot of you guys are this weekend, if you listen to HD's talk, this was me, during his talk. He talks so fast and he talks, about things that, and he just assumes that you get it and he starts moving on. You're like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's kind of like, it's what I would call overloading. And that's an example. He wasn't doing that to do social engineering. He was doing that because that's what he does. But folks who have that happen to them, they tend to fail opens. They tend to become fairly passive and say, yeah, just do whatever you need to kind of go away and let me recover. Reciprocation is the you pat my back, I pat yours thing. All right, so using this in a pen test, we talk about social networks. It is a gold mine of information. If you are using social engineering in a pen test and you're not looking at social networks, you're doing it wrong, because that's really one of the first places we start. Other Web 2.0 sites, right? So we got Pastebin, we got Scribed, we got all kinds of other fun places out there where people stash information that allows, that would be useful in trying to persuade them to do things. Maltego is another way. One thing I like about this concept is that social engineering is recursive, right? So if it's not open source, well, social engineer the person out of the information that you need. If it's so you can, it's recursive, and then use that in a different scam, basically. Manipulated notions to attackers' advantage. some really, really effective ones. So the stronger the emotion burns, the more likely it is to be effective, right? So we got fear, anger, greed, lust. Those are pretty intense emotions that people tend to feel. If you can get someone to feel that emotion in the course of a penetration test, you're going to be pretty effective at being able to influence them. Delivery method. It's really just the first step, right? So getting into using social engineering is really not the end-all be-all. It can be in some circumstances. We talk about that on 4. So you can get the information directly that you're looking for through the individual, or you can use it as a first step, right? So you can use it as getting the foothold on a network, and that's what bad guys do. They get that client-side exploit, get someone to click on something, get someone to download a link, get someone to, and then fire off, and then they use that to further into propagate further into the network. All right, so this is my my set slide. Kind of a fun story. I participated in the ICTF last year, and so getting towards the end of the CTF, they opened up the networks. Before they had it locked off where you couldn't go to the other networks. So got an IRC, changed my handle basically to 1 character off from the administrator handle. Say, here's a hint on a flag worth 1,000 points. Cloned the website that actually where they had the submission stuff, and sent it out. Had 69 teams and 53 shells, which was a lot of fun, right? They basically we had all of the folks on. These are security professionals clicking on the link. It was fun. Next. Dave's an awesome guy for creating the tool, and it's very, very, very useful. If you want to know more about that, I would check out one of the books, because I'm not the expert by any means. All right, so social psychology applied. So how do we actually fix this problem, right? So we talked about how we can use it as a bad guy. We talked about why it works. How do we actually fix the problem? So I would argue that social engineering is a form of illegitimate persuasion. So we talk about ways of instilling illegitimate persuasion. Now look, this has been studied since, the first article I really found on illegitimate persuasion that was published was in 1964. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this, right? So if you let someone know that a social engineering attack is coming, they're gonna be prepared for it, right? They're gonna be on guard. Like, I'm not clicking any links, right? That's not gonna happen to me. But what's interesting is that forewarning as a control drops off really quickly over time, right? So you have like this, it works for about, then it goes whoop. So, right, so the effectiveness goes down rapidly after a set period of time. Inoculation is basically giving someone a safe dose of I call this, giving someone examples, right? So this is what a social engineering attack looks like. And this is like the next step. This is what we do in most of our training sessions, right? We talk about, hey, social engineering's out there, don't click on links. Here's what a link, a bad guy link might look like. And that's actually fairly effective, but it can actually bolster someone's attitudes of resistance, think they're they're less susceptible than they actually are. And then a guy named Sagarin, Kevin Mitnick actually collaborated with Brad Sagarin to write a book, at least a chapter of a book, The Art of Intrusion. Anybody read The Art of Intrusion? Right, so chapter 10 was written in collaboration with Brad Sagarin. He actually had this idea that in order to reduce someone's susceptibility to persuasion, you have to actually dispel their illusion of invulnerability. You have to make them realize that they too are actually potentially vulnerable to this type of attack, for lack of a better term. So our current training really uses forewarning and inoculation and ignores some of the other techniques. So the most effective training is actually going to incorporate all of these techniques. So how to actually prevent social engineering from being successful. So I would argue that social engineering is a control unto itself. What do I mean by that? Sure, you need to train your employees. You need to test your employees. You need to determine whether or not they are susceptible. How do you know if the control is working if you don't test it? Auditors in the background, right? We need to be able to test the control. We need to let them know that they're being tested. This is forewarning, right? This is layering the ideas and the concepts of inoculation resistance to persuasion on top of each other to create a very effective control. And then watch your susceptibility drop. So if you incorporate all of these, you can reduce your susceptibility up to a factor of 10. What I mean by that is that you can take a susceptibility from maybe, say that you run your initial set of tests, right? So you conduct a phishing campaign at your organization, and you have a response rate of 35%. Well, over time, you can actually drop that to 3.5%. And that's been demonstrated over and over again at companies that do this. So we need to actually test folks as a control. All right, so that's more or less the end of my talk. I know I'm way under time, but some shout outs, folks that I had really good conversations have influenced this talk a lot. Mike Murray, Chris Hadnaghy, Nickerson, Roberts, I think I saw you in the background somewhere, and Dave. A couple to my buddies as well. So here's some suggested reading. You'll notice there's only one book on there that has anything to do with information security. If you want to know more about influence and how to understand what's happening to people when they get social engineered, read these books, right? So the influence, that's like the premier book. If you want to understand influence and persuasion, read the top book. If you don't read any one of the others, read the top book. The others there are interesting. If you want to learn to be a better social engineer, those are the bottom books, right? So Getting to Yes, Getting Past No, Reading People, Words That Change Minds, Selling the Way Your Customers Buy. All those books are useful for learning how to influence people, right? All right, so that's basically my talk. Oh, and Social Engineering by Chris Hadnaghy. That's a good book. Yeah, I didn't want to. He's a good dude. If you're not reading, if you haven't read that book and you're interested in social engineering, you should. All right, so fair winds, friendly skies. Thanks everybody for coming, and I appreciate it. Any questions? Yeah. All right, so the question is, he has an issue with the word coercion in there as a differentiator between influence and persuasion. I would argue, yeah, that as you define coercion there, yes, I would argue that that's a valid argument. The way I kind of use coercion, it's difficult. It's influence with an element to actually get someone to do something, right? That's how I would define, right. So that's how I would find. Maybe I poorly define coercion. I tried to use one word to get someone to do something, and maybe that was a poor use of the word coercion. But I would argue that the defining characteristics between influence and persuasion is the getting someone to do something part actively, as opposed to more subtly that influence does, right? So influence, you can use a very subtle means of getting some. Right? And you don't even mean to get someone to do something, right? You can just be a leader and you can be very charismatic and you don't mean to make that person go out and do something, but you've influenced them without knowing it, essentially. Maybe influence with intent, right? But good question. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so there's a person at a front, security guard, right? And so you have someone come up to the security guard, and they're trying to register to be a visitor, right? So you have someone else who comes in with, you ever seen the movie Hackers? Movie Hackers, right? Right, with the balloons. That's overloading, right? So that's someone getting someone so distracted. Yeah. I'm just going to scan you in. Here you go, and they basically fail open. I need you to just go away and make my life easier for the moment. Good question. Any others? No? All right. Well, if you want to come up and talk afterwards, great. But thanks for coming.